Before I read you this letter, I want to say one small thing. I get a great deal of mail, and most of it breaks my heart in the same quiet way. Not all at once, but slowly, the way you notice a room has gone cold. This week, a woman named Dorothy wrote to me, 68 years old, a retired teacher, 34 years in a classroom in central Ohio. She buried her husband alone. She raised her son alone. And then, over 2.5 years, the people she loved most turned her into a transaction. She asked me to tell it honestly, no softening. Her words were, "I don't want to sound like a victim. I want people to understand what it actually looks like, because it doesn't look dramatic."
It looks like a Tuesday. Dorothy, this one is for you. Let's begin.
I had spent 34 years teaching 8th grade English at Millbrook Middle School in a small town in central Ohio, the kind of town where the man at the gas station knew your car before he knew your name, where the same family cycled through the same churches and the same ball fields and the same 2 funeral homes for generations, and where a good teacher left fingerprints on a community that lasted long after she was gone. Dorothy was that kind of teacher. She had the one skill that separates the teachers people remember from the ones they forget. She could read a room. She could stand at the front of her classroom on a gray Monday morning in February, 26 13-year-olds slumped in their chairs, and within 5 minutes she knew. She knew which one hadn't slept. She knew which one had been crying in the bathroom before the bell. She knew which one had a parent who'd come home angry the night before, and which one was carrying something they didn't have words for yet. She didn't always say anything. Sometimes the kindest thing was to let a child keep their privacy and simply make the room safe. But she always knew, and the students trusted her for it, even though most of them could never have explained why. You can always tell when a person is genuinely paying attention to you. You can feel it even when you're 13 and don't have the language, especially then. She had won 3 state-level teaching awards over the years. Twice she'd been asked to move into administration, and twice she'd said no. She had no interest in spending her days managing adults in meetings. She wanted to be in the room for the moment a hard book finally cracked open for a kid who had sworn up and down that he hated reading. That small, almost invisible moment when a face changes and something lets go. That was the thing she did. She stayed close to it for 34 years, and she never once regretted it. She retired at 63. Her knee had finally given out, an old injury made worse by decades of standing on a hard tile floor 6 hours a day, and her surgeon had told her the replacement was, in his words, long overdue. The retirement party was held in the school gymnasium on the last Friday of the school year. Former students drove back from Columbus, from Cleveland, from as far as Pittsburgh. Some of them brought their own children. Parents she'd taught alongside for decades carried in covered dishes and set them out on folding tables the way people did in that part of Ohio for every occasion that mattered, happy or sad. The principal, Tom Garrett, who had worked beside Dorothy for 20 years, stood at the podium and tried to say she was the kind of teacher who changes the direction of a child's whole life. And he got about halfway through before his voice broke, and he had to stop and look at the floor and breathe before he could go on. Dorothy sat in the front row in her good blue dress and watched him struggle, and she smiled the composed, faintly amused smile she had perfected over 34 years of watching people try to hold themselves together in front of a crowd. She had spent her whole career being the steady one. She was steady now. Then she went home, and the house was quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. Not the good kind of quiet, not the peaceful hush of a Sunday morning with coffee and the newspaper. It was a quiet that felt empty rather than restful, a quiet with a hole in the middle of it. Her husband Gerald had died 4 years before, a cardiac event, fast and without any warning at all. It happened on a Saturday morning in October while he was out in the backyard raking leaves. Dorothy had been inside making a fresh pot of coffee. She'd gone out to the back step to tell him it was ready, the screen door banging behind her the way it always did, and she'd found him on the ground near the back fence, already past the point where anything she did was going to matter. She had done CPR anyway. She had knelt on the cold grass in her house slippers and done compressions until the ambulance came because she was Dorothy, and she did not stop doing the thing that needed doing simply because it had stopped working. She would not let herself stop. The paramedics had to take her hands and lift her gently away. They had been married 31 years. Gerald had taught high school history, one town over at the school where their own son had eventually graduated. Their house had always been full of books with cracked spines, full of stacks of student papers waiting to be graded, full of the low and comfortable disorder of two people who both brought their work home and neither of whom ever quite finished it. After he died, the papers disappeared, the books stayed, and the disorder slowly became stillness. Her sister Margaret lived in Phoenix, too far away for regular visits, but close enough for weekly phone calls. Over the previous 2 years, though, even those calls had thinned out. Dorothy had become aware, in a way she didn't like to examine too closely, that she'd run out of things to say to Margaret that didn't somehow circle back to Ryan and Brittany. And she had started to sense, only dimly, the way you sense weather changing, that Margaret didn't enjoy those updates nearly as much as Dorothy seemed to need to give them. For 4 years after Gerald, work had held Dorothy together. The classroom gave her a structure that grief simply could not get through during school hours. There was no room for it between the bell schedule and the lesson plans, and 26 children who needed her. And by the time she got home each evening, she was too tired to feel the full weight of the empty house. It was not healing exactly. It was a kind of deferral. She was putting the grief in a drawer every morning and being too exhausted to open the drawer at night. And when she retired, the deferral ended all at once, and she found herself at 63 in a silent house with a healed knee and absolutely nothing on the calendar for Tuesday. She did not know who she was when no one needed her. That was the truth at the bottom of it, though it would take her a long time to be able to say it plainly. For 4 decades, she had been needed by students, by Gerald in his last years when his blood pressure was bad, by the whole machinery of a working life, needed in the shape of her days. And now the need was gone, and she stood in the middle of her own quiet living room and did not recognize the woman whose days had suddenly emptied out. Her son Ryan was 36 at the time. He lived 40 minutes away in Columbus with his wife, Brittany. They had married 5 years earlier in a hotel ballroom downtown, a wedding Dorothy had helped plan and had contributed $8,000 toward money she had given gladly. She remembered standing near the back of the reception that evening, a glass of champagne she wasn't drinking warm in her hand, watching the two of them turn slowly on the dance floor under the string lights. She had felt a careful, guarded hope Gerald should have been there to see it. He wasn't, and the place where he should have been standing beside her had its own particular ache. But Ryan looked happy. Brittany looked beautiful. And from that angle on that evening, the future had looked like it might just be all right after all. Dorothy had worked hard to love Brittany. She would admit that later, to her lawyer, to her sister, and eventually in the privacy of her own kitchen, to herself. Loving Brittany had taken effort, not because Brittany was cruel. She wasn't, not in any way you could point to. It was that Brittany was only legible in a certain kind of light. At a party, at a wedding, at any occasion with an audience, she was warm and quick and funny in a sharp, observant way that Dorothy genuinely enjoyed. But one-on-one, in a conversation that wasn't serving some purpose of Brittany's own, she went vague and distracted, her eyes sliding to her phone, her attention thinning to almost nothing, in a way that left Dorothy feeling faintly, inexplicably invisible. Dorothy had explained it away. Brittany was an introvert. It was the natural friction of a new daughter-in-law. They simply didn't have much in common beyond Ryan. For 5 years, she had extended every benefit of every doubt, generously and automatically, the way she'd once extended grace to a difficult student. She would come to recognize this as one of the most expensive habits she had ever formed. Not in dollars, though it would cost her plenty of those too, but in the way it kept her from ever arriving at the full truth of a person. That's how it works. You revise your read of someone downward in tiny increments, and each single revision feels reasonable and small and forgivable, and you stop just short of the real picture every single time. You spare them, and in sparing them, you spare yourself the thing you don't want to know. She stopped sparing them the day she saw the graduation photographs, but that came later. For now, Dorothy was 63, freshly retired and recently widowed in the part of her heart that didn't care about the legal calendar. Grief keeps its own clock, and 4 years had not moved it as far as everyone seemed to assume. She lived alone in a paid-off three-bedroom house, on a street of paid-off three-bedroom houses. She had a teacher's pension of $2,400 a month, steady and dependable, and she had $180,000 in life insurance money that Gerald had left her, specifically and deliberately, so that she could live the rest of her life in comfort and never have to worry. That was what she had. By the time she truly understood what had happened to it, most of it was already gone. Ryan Callahan was, by almost any measure, a likable man. He was tall, the way Gerald had been tall, and he had a salesman's easy confidence, the kind of warmth that arrives quickly and looks completely genuine, even on the occasions when it isn't. He had gone to Ohio State on a partial scholarship, studied communications, graduated somewhere in the comfortable middle of his class, and drifted into pharmaceutical sales in his mid-20s with the natural ease of a man who had been anxious researching for that exact career his entire life. When he applied himself, he was good at it. He remembered the names of every receptionist at every clinic on his route. He remembered their kids' names. He made people feel attended to, and people rewarded him for it. He was also, and had always been, terrible with money, not in a dramatic headline way. There was no gambling, no secret addiction, no hidden second life. It was simpler and quieter than that. Ryan had a persistent, lifelong inability to connect the abstract idea of a future consequence to the very concrete, very immediate appeal of comfort right now. He spent what he had, and when he ran short, which was often, he found a way to close the gap. For most of his adult life, the way he closed the gap was his mother. Dorothy had never once thought of it as a pattern. That was the thing she would come to understand. Sitting alone at her kitchen table much later, each instance had always arrived wearing its own particular face. A dental bill 1 year, a short month on the rent another, a car that needed brakes. Each one had seemed, in isolation, like a single discrete problem with a single obvious solution, and she had solved each one as it came, the way she'd solved problems in her classroom for 34 years. Practically, immediately, without stepping back to ask whether the problems themselves were a symptom of something larger and more structural underneath. The first real ask, after her retirement, came about 3 months in. Ryan called on a Sunday evening. She could hear it in his voice right away, tired, a little apologetic, the careful tone of someone who has rehearsed his opening sentence in the car. He and Brittany had found a new apartment, he explained. Still a rental, but a much better neighborhood, and crucially, much closer to his sales territory, which would save him real money on gas every week. The trouble was the move-in cost. First month, last month, security deposit. It came to $3,800, and they were short by about $2,400. He had a commission check coming in March that would more than cover it. Could she help bridge the gap just until March? Dorothy said yes before he had even finished the sentence. She wrote the check the next morning. She drove it to the post office herself in the cold, and walking back to her car across the gravel. She felt something she hadn't felt in months, the clean, simple satisfaction of being useful. And it's important to be honest about that feeling, because the feeling was real, and the feeling was the whole engine of what came after. She was not stupid. She was not naive. She was filling a need, her own need, the one that retirement had cracked open and left exposed. The need to matter to someone in a way that was practical and immediate and could be measured. Ryan had handed her that need on a Sunday evening, and she had taken it from him with both hands, gratefully, almost with relief. March came. The commission arrived. Ryan mentioned it in passing on a call, pleased with himself. He did not mention the $2,400, and Dorothy did not bring it up. She told herself, quickly and firmly that it had been a gift and not a loan, that this was what parents did, that the whole point of having money was to help your children. What she did not do, what she did not let herself do, was sit quietly with the fact that the question of repayment made her so deeply reluctant to open her mouth. She didn't ask why she was afraid to ask. She just closed the drawer. The months that followed established the rhythm of the thing, and the rhythm was clever, even if no one had consciously designed it, because the amount was never the same twice. That was what hid the pattern from her. A car repair, $750. A doctor's visit insurance hadn't fully covered, $430. A short month on the rent, $600, just this once. She paid each one out of savings, and she never kept a running total, because keeping a running total would have required her to look directly at a number. And some part of her already understood that she was not ready to look at the number. And here is the part that matters most, the part she would turn over in her mind 100 times afterward. What accompanied every single ask was warmth. The pattern was nearly perfect. After Dorothy sent money, Brittany would call, not Ryan Brittany, and stay on the phone for 40 minutes. She would tell Dorothy about her week at the salon, about a funny client, about the plans she and Ryan were making, about a recipe she was thinking of trying. She would ask Dorothy how she was doing and actually seemed to listen. And Ryan would text that same evening, "Love you, Mom. Seriously, don't know what we'd do without you." And for 3 or 4 days afterward, Dorothy would feel something she'd been starving for since the day she retired, and the day, 4 years before that, when she'd found Gerald in the yard. She would feel like she had a family again. She was paying for those phone calls. She did not know it yet, but she was paying for every one of them. By the end of the first year, she had given Ryan and Brittany about $14,000. She found this number out later, not while it was happening, because she had not been keeping count. And when she finally did sit down and count it, at her kitchen table, with a yellow legal pad and her bank statement spread out and a highlighter in her hand, she sat very still for a long time afterward, and what she felt was a strange double grief. Grief for the money, yes, but underneath that, a sharper and stranger grief. Grief for the woman who had given it away so eagerly, so gladly, so pathetically grateful for the few days of warmth each payment had purchased. She had been lonely. That was the whole of it. She had been so lonely that she had confused being needed with being loved. They are not the same thing. Most people learn the difference young, when they're still in school, the hard way, with a first heartbreak or a friendship that turned out to be conditional. Dorothy learned it at 63, alone in her kitchen, with a cold cup of coffee and a legal pad covered in yellow highlighter. In the second year, two things happened at the same time, slowly enough that she didn't catch them in real time. The asks grew larger, and the warmth grew thinner. Ryan's pharmaceutical company restructured his sales territory that spring. His base salary held, but his commissions dropped sharply while he spent months rebuilding relationships with a whole new set of clinics. This was a genuine setback, a real one, and Dorothy felt for him. She wanted to help. What she did not see at the time, what she would only see clearly much later with distance, was that Brittany's response to her husband's reduced income was not to pick up more shifts at the salon, was not to cut back on the weekend trips and the dinners out, was not to tighten anything at all. Brittany's response was to call Dorothy more often. Brittany handled the asks now, and she was better at it than Ryan had ever been, softer, more personal, more skilled at the precise emotional register that made saying no feel like an act of cruelty. The calls followed a structure so consistent that Dorothy, looking back, could practically diagram it. The opening was warm, a real conversation, an update, a genuine-sounding question about Dorothy's week. Then the slow pivot toward difficulty. Things were tight. Ryan was so stressed. The new territory was taking longer to come together than anyone had expected. Then the turn, the number itself, always specific, always precise, never rounded up, always with a concrete reason firmly attached to it, so that it didn't feel like an amount of money so much as a particular problem that happened to have a price. And then the close. If Dorothy hesitated, even for a second, even with a single breath of silence, Brittany would introduce a note of shame. I hate even having to ask you this. It's so embarrassing. You must think we're just hopeless with money. And that note of shame short-circuited Dorothy's hesitation every time because it instantly reframed the whole thing. Now her hesitation wasn't a reasonable pause. Now it was something she was doing to Brittany. Now her caution was the thing causing pain. The shame performance was the single most effective tool in the entire sequence, and it worked precisely because Dorothy was a kind woman. Her deepest instinct, the one 34 years of teaching had carved into her, was that when a person in front of you shows you their vulnerability, you move to relieve it. That instinct was one of the very best things about her. It was also, it turned out, the exact lever they leaned on hardest. By the middle of the second year, she was transferring somewhere between $1,200 and $1,800 a month. The varying amounts were part of what kept any single transfer from feeling like a permanent commitment, but the cumulative effect, month over month, was undeniable. Dorothy had quietly taken on financial responsibility for a sizable chunk of two adults' monthly lives, a life she had not chosen in a city she rarely visited, with two people who she was slowly beginning to understand did not actually want her around. She gave them roughly $19,000 in the second year, and there were other amounts on top of that, smaller ones, that she never even captured in her accounting. A tank of gas here, a $40 parking thing there, a copay that Brittany mentioned in passing and that Dorothy simply covered without a word. By the time anyone finally added it all up properly, the true total over the whole period would land just past $38,000. But she didn't know that yet. She was still inside the story she had been telling herself. A generous mother, a good son going through a rough patch, a temporary situation that would surely normalize the moment territory came back around. That story took an enormous amount of work to maintain. Inconvenient feelings had to be set aside before they could grow up into questions. Inconvenient facts had to be reinterpreted in the most generous possible light. And it was exhausting, in a low, grinding, cumulative way, a tiredness that lived underneath everything. She didn't know it was exhausting because she didn't know she was doing it. There is a very specific quality, the experience of being deliberately excluded by someone who is, at the same time, financially dependent on you. It is not the same as ordinary neglect. It is not the same as the natural drift that happens between an aging parent and a grown child building their own busy life. It has a different texture entirely. And the texture is this: it is designed. Dorothy did not understand it as designed while it was happening. She experienced it only as a long string of small disappointments, each one of which came with its own perfectly reasonable explanation. A Sunday dinner would be proposed, and then quietly canceled. Ryan was swamped. It had been a crazy week. They'd reschedule for sure. The reschedule wouldn't happen. A Christmas visit would last exactly 90 minutes and would feel, from the moment the two of them walked through the door, like they were already counting down to when they could leave. The phone calls became almost entirely Brittany, rarely Ryan, and they took on the quality of a performance rather than a conversation. Brittany narrating her own life, at length, asking Dorothy a question or two, and then visibly retaining none of the answers, so that the next call would open with the exact same questions, as though the previous call had never occurred. Dorothy was being maintained, not included. There is a difference, and the difference is everything. She was kept just warm enough to stay engaged, just connected enough to stay grateful, just present enough to keep the money flowing, but never warm enough, never connected enough, never present enough to actually feel like she belonged to anyone. It was a calibration. Whether it was fully conscious on their part, Dorothy could never afterwards say for certain. What she could say was that it was remarkably consistent, and consistency of that particular kind almost never happens entirely by accident. She also did not know, and this fact, when it finally reached her, would land harder than almost anything else, that during this entire period, Ryan and Brittany had a rich and active social life that she was completely absent from. Weekend trips to wine country, concert tickets, dinner parties with friends. A whole hiking vacation in Colorado the previous summer, 10 days, that Dorothy never heard a single word about. She would learn all of this eventually in one painful phone call from Ryan's cousin Angela, a woman who had felt sick about the situation for years and who finally picked up the phone. But in the thick of the second year, Dorothy was still receiving each disappointment alone and in isolation, still patching each small wound with the same generous benefit of the doubt she had been extending for 5 years. The one place the story had begun very faintly to thin was in the silences. There were small silences that came when she mentioned in passing something she'd done entirely on her own. A day trip she'd taken to see a traveling museum exhibit in Columbus, a novel she was reading, a long afternoon she'd spent with her old friend Patricia. The silences were brief, and she might almost have imagined them, but she didn't think she had imagined them. They had a particular flavor, a flavor of mild surprise, as though the fact that Dorothy had a life of her own, separate from them, was an unexpected and slightly inconvenient variable in an equation that had been running smoothly until then. And there was one silence, longer and more pointed than the rest, that came after she mentioned, lightly, with no details at all, that she had been going over her finances and thinking a little about her retirement and the years ahead. She hadn't said anything specific. She hadn't mentioned the transfers, hadn't mentioned the dwindling savings, hadn't accused anyone of anything. She had simply noted, in the most ordinary way, that she'd been doing some financial planning. Brittany had said, after the smallest pause, with a lightness that was very slightly too light, "Oh, that sounds smart. It's always good to stay on top of things." And then she had changed the subject. And then she had called 3 days later to ask for $1,100 for an unexpected car repair. Dorothy paid it. Of course she paid it, but she noticed the sequence. She noticed the way the mention of her own financial planning had been met first with a beat of silence, and then with a brisk redirect, and then, just 72 hours later, with a fresh and urgent request for money, as if to remind her gently of the arrangement, of the channel, of what the relationship was actually for. She noticed. And the noticing was the beginning of the end of the story she had been telling herself. By the spring of the third year, Dorothy had learned, without ever quite deciding to keep her expectations low. Not as a surrender, she would have rejected that word, but as a form of self-protection. She had stopped waiting by the phone for invitations that never came. She had stopped interpreting their silences as oversights and started quietly to interpret them as choices. She was, in her own word for it, managing, getting through, building a small private life of her own around the edges of a family that didn't seem to want her in the center of it. And then, on an ordinary Saturday evening in May, she picked up her phone. Brittany had posted a gallery of photographs. Dorothy saw them at her kitchen table after dinner, scrolling through the small, bright window of her phone in the half-present, habitual way of a woman who lives alone and has learned to fill the silence of the house with a little harmless digital noise. The window over the sink was open. The smell of someone's fresh-cut grass was drifting in on the warm evening air. The refrigerator was humming its low, familiar hum. The first photograph was Brittany in a cap and gown. She was holding a diploma folder, squinting just slightly into the late afternoon sun, and smiling with the full, unguarded, uncomplicated happiness of a person who has worked hard for something and finally received it. And Dorothy's very first reaction, and she would hold on to this afterward as proof that her heart had been in the right place the whole time. Her very first reaction was warmth, real, simple warmth. She had known Brittany was finishing a cosmetology degree. She had followed its progress in pieces in the fragmented and selective way that Brittany narrated her own life. She felt, looking at that first photo, genuinely and uncomplicatedly glad. She kept scrolling, the second photo. Ryan beside Brittany, his arm around her shoulders, grinning into the camera in his good gray sport coat. The one Dorothy recognized because she had been standing right there in the store when he bought it 3 years earlier, before she had understood the shape of any of this. Then the third and the fourth and the fifth. Brittany's parents, her mother in a soft floral dress, pressing a folded tissue to the corner of one eye. Her father, broad-shouldered and beaming, one proud hand resting on his daughter's shoulder. Brittany's sister, Brittany's brother-in-law. Two women Dorothy didn't recognize, but who were clearly close friends, laughing, their arms thrown around each other, champagne flutes raised high in a restaurant with warm, low lighting and a chalkboard menu just visible on the wall behind them. Everyone was there. Everyone was assembled. Everyone who mattered was present and accounted for. Dorothy scrolled all the way back to the first photograph, and then she went through every single one again, slowly this time. She had given $6,000 toward Brittany's tuition and her textbooks over the 2 years of that program. She had not even been asked for it. She had offered freely because that was who she was, and because at the time contributing to Brittany's education had felt like a way of being woven into their lives, of being part of something that was building, of mattering. And Brittany had accepted the $6,000 with all the warmth she always produced on the occasion of accepting money. The same warmth Dorothy was only now sitting at her kitchen table with the grass smell coming through the window, beginning to understand had never been a feeling at all. It had been a transaction. It had been the receipt. She had not been told the graduation was happening. She sat at the table for a long, long time. Outside, somewhere down the block, a neighbor's dog barked twice and then went quiet. The light in the kitchen shifted from gold to gray to the deep blue gray of an early Ohio evening, and still she did not move. Her dinner plate sat unwashed beside the sink where she'd left it, and it wasn't the exclusion itself. That hurt, certainly. It hurt in a specific, located physical way, like pressing your thumb on a bruise you didn't know you had. But the exclusion was almost beside the point. What undid her, sitting in the dark kitchen, was the absence of information. Not a phone call, not a text, not even the most casual mention. Oh, by the way, the graduation's on the 18th. I know it's a long drive and totally fine if you can't make it, but you're welcome. Nothing. The event had been planned, and a guest list had been drawn up, and a restaurant had been reserved, and the whole thing had been attended and photographed and posted to the entire world. And Dorothy had found out about it the exact same way she would have found out about something happening to total strangers, after the fact, through a screen. As an audience member, never a participant, she had helped pay for the education that was being celebrated in those photographs. And she had not been judged worth the cost of a single text message. She called Ryan that evening. She made herself wait until her voice was steady, and then she dialed. And when he answered, she kept her tone perfectly, deliberately measured, the same measured tone she had kept for 34 years in classrooms full of teenagers watching closely to see whether they could finally get a rise out of Mrs. Callahan. I saw Brittany's graduation photos, she said. It looked like a wonderful day. Congratulations to her. Yeah, it was great. He sounded relaxed, not guilty, not braced for anything, just relaxed. I didn't know it was happening, Dorothy said. And there it was, the pause. Brief. And in that brief pause, Dorothy did the thing she had always done, the thing 34 years had trained into her bones. She paid attention not to the words, but to the precise shape of the silence that came before them. I thought Brittany told you, Ryan said. You know how things get. It was a crazy few weeks. She didn't tell me. I'm sorry about that, Mom. That was an oversight. Oversight. The word was exactly wrong, and Dorothy felt the wrongness of it before she could have explained it. An oversight is something careless, something accidental, a thing you forget in the rush. But what she had just looked at, photograph after photograph, was not careless and was not accidental. It was a deliberately assembled gathering of everyone who mattered, a planned event with a reserved table and a curated guest list, and she was simply not on it. It was not a thing forgotten. It was a list that had been carefully made, and her name had not been written on it. We should do something to celebrate with you, Ryan said, and he was already moving, already past it, already in the easy forward motion of a man who was not the slightest bit troubled by the conversation he was having. Maybe dinner sometime next month. But actually, since I've got you on the phone, Mom, things have been kind of tight again. The territory thing is still sorting itself out. Do you think you might be able to? I'll think about it, Dorothy said, and she ended the call. She set the phone face down on the table, and she sat in the dark for a long time. She was not crying. She was doing the thing she had always done when something in front of her required genuine, serious thought. She was sitting perfectly still, and she was being honest with herself, more honest than she had let herself be in 2.5 years. I helped pay for that program, she thought. I have been giving them money for 2.5 years. I have rearranged my entire financial life. I have spent down the money Gerald left me so I could be safe in my old age. I have said yes to every single thing they have ever asked me for, and I was not told this was happening. And in the very same 3 minutes that I learned I had been left out, I was asked for more money. And then she thought the thing she had been refusing to think for a very long time. She made herself ask it directly. When was the last time Ryan called me without needing something? She went back through her memory carefully, methodically, the way she'd once gone back through a student's file, looking for the moment things had started to go wrong. She was searching for one call, just one purely social phone call that had opened with, "Hey, Mom, how are you? I was just thinking about you," and nothing else behind it. She went back 3 months, 6, 8. She could not find one. She sat with that. She let it be true. She did not soften it or explain it away or extend anyone the benefit of any doubt. She just let it sit there in the dark kitchen with her, the plain, unbearable fact of it. Then she stood up. She washed her dinner plate. She dried her hands on the towel that hung on the oven door, the one with the faded roosters on it that Gerald had always teased her about. She walked down the hall to the small back room she still called the study, even though Gerald had been the one who used it, and she sat down and opened her laptop, and into the search bar she typed 3 words: elder financial exploitation. She read until midnight. The reading was disorienting in the exact way that recognition is always disorienting, not because the information was strange and new, but because it was so deeply, sickeningly familiar. The words on the screen described, in clean clinical language, a sequence of events that she had lived through, day by day for 2.5 years, without ever once knowing that the sequence had a name. It was, she read, the most common form of elder abuse in the United States. It was estimated to touch roughly 1 in 10 older adults. It was vastly, almost completely underreported because the people who did it were almost always the people the victim loved most, and because the victims were ashamed, and because the whole thing was designed from the ground up to be deniable. And in the great majority of documented cases, the perpetrators were family members. She read the documented tactics, and she felt the floor tilt slowly beneath her, because she could have written the list herself from memory. Requests framed as urgent and temporary, so that the target never steps back far enough to see the structure. Just until March. Affection deployed strategically around the financial asks, training the victim's own brain to associate giving money with receiving love. The 40-minute phone calls. The text that same evening. The slow, patient isolation of the target from any outside perspective that might offer a clear-eyed second opinion. Margaret, Patricia, everyone she'd quietly drifted away from. And the gradual, almost invisible normalization of dependency, so that each new request arrived against a baseline that had already quietly shifted, again and again, far from where it had started. She recognized all of it, every single piece. And then she read the part that made her stop and read it again and then sit very still in the dark. She read about what so often happened when the victim finally stopped the money. The response, the sources said, was frequently not acceptance. It was not understanding, and it was not a graceful retreat. It was escalation. When a target stopped giving voluntarily, the people who had depended on that giving often moved instead to take control of it involuntarily. And the single most common mechanism for doing that was a petition for guardianship, filed in probate court, arguing that the older adult had become mentally incompetent and could no longer be trusted to manage their own affairs, and that a responsible family member, therefore, ought to be appointed to manage those affairs for them. She read about how these petitions were built, the supporting statements gathered from people with minimal, distant, or distorted contact with the target. The use of the victim's own perfectly rational protective measures, changing locks, installing a camera, consulting an attorney, recast as evidence of paranoia and decline. the systematic reframing of an older person's clear-eyed self-protection as the confused behavior of someone who needed protecting. Dorothy read the paragraph 3 times. Then she closed the laptop, and she sat alone in the dark study, and she listened to the small sounds of her house settling around her in the night. She was not panicking. She noticed that about herself, almost with a kind of detached interest. She was not panicking. What she felt instead was something cold and clean and clarifying rising up from somewhere very deep. It was anger, but it was a particular kind of anger. The anger of a person who has just realized she has been badly, fundamentally underestimated by people who, of all people, should have known better. 34 years of standing in front of rooms full of 13-year-olds had given Dorothy a very specific, very personal relationship with the experience of being underestimated. She knew exactly what it felt like, and she knew exactly what she did with it. The next morning at 7:15, she picked up the phone and called her accountant. Phil Schaefer had handled Dorothy and Gerald's finance for over 15 years. He was methodical and conservative and quiet, a man who had never once in all those years tried to impress anybody, and Dorothy had always trusted him precisely because of that. He picked up on the second ring. "Dorothy, everything all right? I need to understand exactly where I stand," she said, "financially, all of it. And I need to know what I can do to protect my accounts." Phil called her back that afternoon, after he'd had a few hours to pull everything together, and he walked her through the whole picture in his careful, unhurried voice. Her pension was secure and untouchable, $2,400 a month for the rest of her life, no matter what. Her house was paid off, worth roughly $215,000 in the current market, and her savings, the savings that had stood at $180,000 on the October morning Gerald died, now stood at $63,400. At the rate she had been drawing them down, he told her gently, those savings would be entirely gone in about 4 years. She was 68 years old. The average woman her age, Phil noted, could expect to live another 19 years. 4 years of money against 19 years of life. And that was before you accounted for the near certainty of rising medical costs as she got older. There was a pause on the line. Then Phil said carefully, in the tone of a man choosing his words, "Dorothy, can I ask, is there a family situation here I should understand?" So she told him. She told him all of it, start to finish, from the $3,800 security deposit 2.5 years before, straight through to the graduation photographs the night before. She told it precisely in order, because she was a precise woman and she had spent the early hours of the morning organizing it in her mind. Phil listened without interrupting once, which she would always be grateful for. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I want to give you a name. Carol Whitmore. She's an elder law attorney here in Columbus. I've sent a few clients her way over the years. She is very good, and this matters. She is completely straight with people. What you've just described to me is precisely the kind of thing she handles." Dorothy wrote the name down on the legal pad in front of her. Carol Whitmore. She called the office the next morning, and the earliest appointment they had was the following Tuesday, and she took it. And that month, for the first time in 2.5 years, she did not transfer the money. The call from Ryan came 4 days after the rent would have been due. She heard it in his voice the instant he started talking, a careful, controlled, faintly off quality, the sound of a man executing a conversation rather than simply having one. "Mom, I think there might have been a banking issue or something. The transfer didn't come through this month. There's no issue," Dorothy said evenly. "I've decided to stop the transfers." The silence that followed was longer than his usual silences. And in that silence, Dorothy did the thing she had done her whole life. She listened to what wasn't being said. And what she heard very distinctly was not surprise. It was preparation. He had thought about this possibility before. He had a script ready for it. And in that silence, he was simply deciding which page of the script to begin on. He chose concern. "Mom, are you okay? Are you feeling all right? It was so fast." She had told him she was stopping the money less than 30 seconds ago, and already he had skipped clean past. Why, and can we talk about this, and landed directly all right? A sentence that sounded like tenderness and was folded up small inside it, the quiet suggestion that the act of stopping was itself a symptom of something being wrong with her. I'm fine, she said. I've made a decision about my finances. I believe it's the right one. Can we come over and talk about this in person? Not right now. I need some time to think. She ended the call and she stood in her kitchen and looked down at her own hands, and she noticed, with something close to wonder, that they were not shaking. She had braced for something enormous: guilt, grief, the dizzy vertigo of a habit, 2.5 years deep, being snapped off all at once. She felt none of it. What she felt was clarity. The clarity was not comfortable, exactly, but it was solid. It held her weight, and solid ground was something Dorothy had not stood on in a very, very long time. The following Tuesday at 10 o'clock, she arrived 10 minutes early at Carol Whitmore's office, which was up a steep staircase on the second floor of a narrow brick building, above a dry cleaner that had clearly been there since the 70s. The door had a frosted glass panel with the name stenciled on it in plain black letters. No gold leaf, no marble, no wall of diplomas designed to intimidate. Dorothy approved of all of it. She had sent her financial records ahead at Carol's request, and Carol had actually read them before the appointment, which Dorothy would later mark as the very first sign of the woman's quality. Carol did not waste your time making you explain things she could have read for herself. Carol Whitmore was 57, solidly built, with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the unhurried, level directness of a person who had stopped performing her authority a long time ago because she simply no longer needed to. She asked Dorothy a series of precise and slightly uncomfortable questions, and she made Dorothy answer them honestly, even where the honest answers was hard. Did the transfers ever feel coerced? Not explicitly, Dorothy said, not in any way you could point to and call coercion, but structured so that refusing always felt costly, emotionally costly, relationally costly. Did the warmth and affection reliably correlate with the financial asks? Yes. Dorothy had mapped it herself, going back through her phone records and her bank statements a single long Tuesday night. Had she ever raised the pattern directly and been redirected? Once. About 14 months in, she had not raised it again. Carol set down her pen. The total outflow to Ryan and Brittany over this period, she said, is approximately $38,200. Does that match your own accounting? Within a few $100s, Dorothy said. All right. Carol folded her hands on the desk and looked at her directly. I'm going to be straight with you because I think it's what you'd prefer. What you have described to me is a textbook pattern of elder financial exploitation. I know how hard that sentence is to hear in connection with your own son, so let me be precise about what I mean. I am not telling you Ryan is a predator in the way we usually picture that word. I'm telling you that a dynamic developed between the three of you, a dynamic that your grief and your loneliness made you genuinely vulnerable to, and that the two of them, whether they did it consciously or only half consciously, learned to sustain and to expand. And here is the thing you need to understand. The mechanism is the same regardless of intent, and the harm is the same regardless of intent. Dorothy sat with that. She found she appreciated the precision of it. It neither excused them nor turned her son into a monster. It simply named the thing accurately, and accuracy, after 2.5 years of fog, felt like a window thrown open. There's something else, Carol went on. In 19 years of doing this work, I can tell you that when a target finally stops the money, the response is very rarely graceful. The first thing that comes is pressure, emotional, familial, social. And if the pressure doesn't work, if you hold, then in a significant number of cases, it escalates to a petition for guardianship. The argument they'll make is that you've become mentally incompetent, that the very decision to stop giving them money is itself evidence of your decline, and that a responsible family member therefore needs to be appointed to take over your finances entirely, for your own good. They've already started the language, Dorothy said quietly. Ryan asked if I was feeling all right within 30 seconds of my telling him I'd stopped. Brittany used the word judgment the last time we spoke. Carol nodded slowly. She did not look surprised. Then we start now, she said. Today. She laid it out, step by step, sequential and clear, and the clarity of it steadied Dorothy after months of trying to manage her own confusion entirely alone. Complete cessation of all transfers, effective immediately, with no exceptions. Because the moment you leave a door open even an inch, Carol said, the pressure comes straight through it. Protection on all her accounts through the bank. A revision of her will and her advance directives, with Carol's oversight, to be certain they reflected Dorothy's true wishes and had not been quietly shaped by anyone. And documentation, a dated notebook recording every single contact going forward, every call, every text, every visit, with the specific language used and the time it occurred. That last one is the most important thing I'm asking of you, Carol said. Not because I'm certain we'll need it, but because if we do need it, the difference between having it and not having it is the difference between a strong case and a weak one. And I never want to be standing in a courtroom wishing you'd written something down. Dorothy nodded. She had, in fact, already started the notebook. Something that was almost approval crossed Carol's face. Good, she said. One more thing. I want you evaluated by a neuropsychologist, Dr. Susan Park at Ohio State Medical. Not because I have the slightest doubt about your competence. I don't. But because if this goes where I think it may go, an assessment that exists on the record before any petition is filed is worth tens what the same assessment is worth as a defensive scramble afterward. I'd rather build the wall now, while the weather's still clear. You're preparing for the petition, Dorothy said. I'm preparing for the possibility of one. There's a meaningful difference, and I want you to hold on to it. Carol looked at her steadily over the reading glasses. And Dorothy, I'll tell you something. Most of the clients who walk through that door come to me after the petition has already been filed, after everything has escalated and they're frightened and scrambling. You came early. You came while we still have time to build something solid. I cannot overstate what an advantage that is. Dorothy drove home that afternoon on the long, flat highway that ran west out of Columbus, back through the wide green Ohio farmland she had lived inside her entire life. The June fields were tall and bright on either side of her. She passed a water tower she had driven past 10,000 times. She passed the exit for Millbrook, and she kept her hands steady on the wheel the whole way, and she was not afraid, exactly. What she felt instead was the particular clarity of a person who knows the hard conversation ahead is necessary and who has quietly decided to be equal to it. Ryan and Brittany were not, it turned out, prepared to accept the end of the arrangement quietly. The phone call had been on a Wednesday. They arrived at her house the following Sunday afternoon, without calling first. Dorothy saw them from the kitchen window. Ryan's car pulling into the driveway, and then Brittany already out and crossing the lawn with the purposeful head-up stride of a woman who has decided in advance exactly how a conversation is going to go. Ryan trailing a few steps behind her with his hands pushed down in his pockets and his shoulders rounded forward. And Dorothy stood at the window and felt the old pull rise up in her, the way it always did, the deep automatic urge to rush to the door, to put the kettle on, to soften everything, to make sure everyone was comfortable before a single one of her own needs had even been spoken aloud. She had been feeling that pull her entire life. This time she stood still, and she watched it rise, and she let it pass all the way through her without following it anywhere. Then she opened the door. "Come in," she said. And then before either of them could get a word out, "I want you both to know that I've consulted an attorney, and I'm clear on my rights." The word attorney did not land the way she'd half expected. She had braced for some flash of guilt, some flicker of being caught. That wasn't what crossed their faces. What crossed their faces was recalibration. Brittany's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, and Dorothy caught the shift precisely because she had been watching for it. Ryan glanced sideways at Brittany. A whole quiet conversation passed between them in that single look. They sat down in the living room. Dorothy lowered herself into Gerald's old armchair, deliberately, the one chair in the room that had always been his. And she did not offer them coffee. She had thought about this ahead of time. The offering of coffee was a hospitality reflex, a small ritual that established warmth and reciprocity and a sense that everyone here was on the same side. and she did not want to establish warmth and reciprocity. She wanted to have a clear, plain, honest conversation. So she sat in Gerald's chair with her hands folded, and she let the room be a little cool. She told them what she had told Brittany on the phone, that she had reviewed her finances, that she had determined the transfers were no longer compatible with her own long-term security, and that she had stopped them. She said it without accusation. She did not use the word exploitation. She did not raise her voice. She simply stated facts. She was a teacher. Stating facts plainly in a room where people would rather she didn't was the oldest skill she had. Brittany spoke first. "Dorothy," she said gently, leaning forward, her whole face arranged into soft and loving concern. "I hear what you're saying, and I want you to know that we completely respect your autonomy." She let the word autonomy sit there for a beat, and the way she said it made it sound like a word she had recently read somewhere, a word she had practiced. "But, and I only say this because I love you, I do think you might be working through some right now that are affecting your judgment. The isolation since you retired, losing Gerald, rattling around in this big house all by yourself. It's a lot for anyone, Dorothy. And I just wonder if some of what feels to you like a clear-headed decision might really be coming from a place of pain." "My judgment is fine," Dorothy said. "Mom." Ryan leaned forward now too, elbows on his knees, hands clasped, the very picture of an earnest, worried son. "Nobody's attacking you. We love you. You know that. But you have been different lately. You've been pulling away from us. You went and hired a lawyer without even telling us. Mom, that's not like you. That's just not. And we think maybe it would help to talk to somebody, a therapist, or even just your regular doctor, just to check in, just to be safe." And Dorothy looked at her son. She looked at him for a long moment, and she let herself, just for that moment, see all of him at once. This was the boy she had raised. This was the boy she had carried to the emergency room at 2 in the morning with a fever of 104. This was the boy she had watched in every school play, the boy she had stood beside at his father's graveside in the cold October rain 4 years ago. The two of them sharing one umbrella, his shoulders shaking. This was the child she had loved with the particular, concentrated ferocity of a woman who had wanted more children than she'd been able to have, and who had taken all of that surplus love and poured every last drop of it into one single person. She looked at him, and she saw with a clarity that was almost unbearable that he was not worried about her. He was worried about the money. The worry about her was a costume. The worry about the money was the body wearing it. "Ryan," she said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly. When was the last time you called me? Just called me without needing something?" His mouth opened, and then it closed, and the silence stretched out long and thin between them, across the living room, over Gerald's old coffee table, and it answered the question more completely than any words he could have found. "I'm not asking to hurt you," Dorothy said quietly. "I'm asking because I think the answer matters. And I think somewhere underneath all of this, you know that it does too." Ryan stood up abruptly. His jaw was set tight in the exact way she remembered from when he was 16 and furious and trying with everything he had not to show it. "This isn't productive," he said. "We came here because we love you and we're worried about you. If you don't want our help, then there's nothing we can do." "That's correct," Dorothy said. "There isn't." They left 12 minutes later. Brittany walked out across the lawn without once looking back. Ryan paused in the open doorway, and he turned, and for just a second, his face did something complicated, something Dorothy couldn't fully read, something that might have been genuine, or might have been one more line delivered in a very long performance. "I really do think you should talk to someone, Mom," he said. "I mean that." She thanked him for his concern, and she closed the door. And then she went straight down the hall to the study, and she sat down and she wrote it all into the notebook, the date, the time, how long they'd stayed, and a careful, precise summary of every single thing that had been said. She wrote down Brittany's use of the word autonomy. She wrote down Ryan's suggestion of a therapist and a doctor. She wrote down the whole sequence of it, the loving concern arriving first, and the suggestions of mental decline arriving close behind, riding in on the back of the love. She wrote for 20 unbroken minutes, and then she picked up the phone and left a message at Carol Whitmore's office. Over the next 3 weeks, Ryan and Brittany worked their way through what Dorothy, documenting all of it, came to understand was almost a procedure, a set of escalating tactics tried one after another in order. The first phase was concern, sustained, and spread across every available channel. Ryan called every other day. The calls were brief and solicitous and ended every single time with some variation of, "I just want to make sure you're okay, Mom. You've just seemed so different lately." The word different showed up in nearly every call. Dorothy wrote it down every time. She understood now exactly what she was watching, the careful, patient construction of a story. The story of a woman who had changed, a woman who was no longer herself, a woman whose judgment had quietly, tragically, become something the people who loved her could no longer rely on. The second phase went social. Brittany called Margaret all the way out in Phoenix. Dorothy only learned of it because Margaret called her immediately afterward. "Brittany just reached out to me," Margaret said. "She says she's worried about you. Says you've been isolating yourself and that you've made some financial decisions that seem really out of character. I told her I'd call you directly. So, I'm calling you directly." And Dorothy told her sister everything, the whole long story, from the very first security deposit through the 40-minute phone calls, through the graduation photographs, all the way to the second-floor office above the dry cleaner. Margaret listened the whole way through without interrupting once, which was the thing Dorothy had always loved most about her. And when Dorothy finally finished, Margaret was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For not asking you about this sooner. I noticed things, Dorothy, over the years, the way she talked about you when you weren't in the room. I noticed, and I didn't say anything, because I told myself it wasn't my place. And I'm sorry." "What did she say?" Margaret hesitated, picking her words. "She made it pretty clear that managing the relationship with you was something she thought of as work. Effortful. She said it once at a family dinner, made a little joke out of it. Everyone laughed in that uncomfortable way and moved right along. I should have called you that very night. I'm sorry I didn't." Dorothy wrote it down. Not with bitterness. She had already moved past bitterness into something cooler and far more useful. She wrote it down because it was information. And information was what she was building from now. And then came the third call, the one that mattered most. It came on a Wednesday evening from Ryan's cousin Angela, who sounded both guilty and enormously relieved, as though she'd been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had finally set it down. "I've been wanting to call you for months," Angela said. "I honestly didn't know if it was my place." "It's your place," Dorothy said. "Tell me." And Angela told her about the gatherings, the barbecues, the birthday parties. The casual summer cookouts that Dorothy had never been invited to and had never even known were happening. The Colorado trip. For most of those 2.5 years, Angela said, she had assumed Dorothy either knew about all of it and had chosen not to come, or had been invited and declined. It hadn't occurred to her, not until she saw the graduation photos and noticed Dorothy wasn't anywhere in them, that the exclusion was the whole point. "There was a dinner party," Angela said slowly, "maybe a year and a half ago. And Brittany said, she said that handling Dorothy was basically a part-time job. And she said it like it was funny, like it was just this exhausting little chore she'd gotten stuck with. And people laughed, and I didn't. I've thought about that night a lot since." Dorothy wrote every word of it down. Then she thanked Angela and told her gently that there might come a day when she'd need to ask her to put that in a formal statement. And Angela said yes instantly, without a moment's hesitation, in the voice of a person who was deeply relieved to finally be of some use. The third phase, Ryan's phase, arrived on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after the Sunday visit. He called at 9 o'clock, and his voice had changed again. The warmth was gone now. There was a flatness to it, the flatness of a man reading out prepared information rather than speaking from anywhere real. He and Brittany, he said, had consulted a family therapist. And the therapist, he said, had suggested that Dorothy's recent behavioral changes, the financial cutoff, the lawyer, the way she'd withdraw from her family, might indicate cognitive changes associated with grief and social isolation. And the therapist had recommended that Dorothy undergo a formal psychiatric evaluation. What's the therapist's name? Dorothy asked. A pause. Why does that matter? Because if someone is making clinical assessments about my mind, Ryan, I would like to know who they are. It's not like that. We just described the situation to her, and she said it sounded concerning. Ryan, Dorothy's voice was very calm. I have an attorney now. Her name is Carol Whitmore. From this point forward, any communication about my mental health or about my finances needs to go through her. I'll text you her number when we hang up. She ended the call and she texted Carol immediately. Carol's reply came back in under 20 minutes. Document the call word for word as best you can. I'll reach out to them today. And Dorothy, if they've already gone and consulted an attorney of their own, then this is closer than I thought it was. Let's get Dr. Parks scheduled this week. Dorothy made herself a fresh cup of coffee, and she carried it out the back door into the garden. The roses Gerald had planted along the back fence all those years ago were fully open now in the June heat, sprawling and overgrown and unruly and gloriously, defiantly alive. He had always loved them a little wild like that. She had always meant to prune them back and never quite had the heart. She stood among them with her coffee going slowly cold in her hands, and she let herself feel it. Finally, fully, all the way down, the grief of it. Not the grief of the money. The other grief, the deeper one. The grief of a mother who had sat in her own living room and looked into her son's face and understood, past all possibility of denial, that she was not looking at a worried child. She was looking at a grown man protecting his financial interests. The grief of knowing, with no room left anywhere for doubt or hope or the benefit of any doubt, that the relationship she had believed she was carefully maintaining for 2.5 years had never actually been a relationship at all. It had been a transaction. She had been paying, month after month after month, for the warm and convincing illusion of a family. And now that she had finally stopped paying, the illusion was dissolving in front of her, gently and completely, and showing her at last the plain bare thing that had been standing underneath it the entire time. She stood out there among Gerald's wild roses, and she let herself feel every bit of it. And then she went back inside and she picked up the phone and she called Patricia, her old friend, her old colleague, the one she had quietly drifted away from over the last lonely year, because as every conversation had somehow ended up being about Ryan and Brittany, and she'd grown ashamed of that. I have something I need to tell you, Dorothy said, and it's going to take a while. I've got nothing but time, Patricia said. Start at the beginning. Carol called on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the Sunday visit. Dorothy was sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee and the newspapers, a small ritual she had quietly reinstated, one of 100 tiny restorations of her own life that she had been making deliberately, one at a time. She answered on the second ring. The petition has been filed, Carol said. Dorothy set down her coffee. Ryan filed this morning in Franklin County Probate Court. He is petitioning for limited guardianship of your person and your estate. The grounds cited are cognitive decline, diminished capacity for financial decision-making, and susceptibility to undue influence by third parties. The third parties, Carol explained, were Carol herself and Phil, Dorothy's own attorney and her own accountant, the two professionals she had hired to protect herself, now recast in the filing as sinister outside influences who had turned a vulnerable old woman against her own loving family. They've attached 3 supporting statements, Carol went on. The first is Brittany's, naturally. The second is from a man named Dennis Farrell. Does that name mean anything to you? Dorothy's jaw tightened. He taught physical education at my school. We had a disagreement 6 years ago over how a student discipline matter was handled. He's held the grudge ever since. I haven't exchanged a word with him in 4 years. Well, Ryan found him. His statement says he's observed significant personality changes in you, and that in his professional judgment, he apparently holds some sort of life coaching certification. Your behavior is consistent with cognitive decline. His professional judgment, Dorothy repeated. The third statement is from a neighbor, a Carl Hutchins. Carl lived directly across the back fence. An older widower fairly isolated himself, who had complained the previous spring about a rescue dog Dorothy had briefly fostered and then rehomed within 2 weeks. He'd been stiffly, distantly polite ever since. His statement says that you installed security cameras in what he describes as an agitated and paranoid state, that you've had a steady stream of unfamiliar visitors coming and going, and that you were seen and heard arguing loudly with family members in your own front yard. Dorothy was quiet for a moment, turning it over. The cameras, installed on Carol's own recommendation, for her protection. The unfamiliar visitors, Patricia and Phil, and a new friend named Roberta she'd met at the retired teacher's lunch. The loud argument in the front yard that had been Ryan's raised voice, not hers, on the day of the Sunday visit, when she declined to let the conversation spill back out onto the lawn. Every single thing in the statement was true, and every single thing in the statement was a lie, because every single thing had been stripped of its real meaning and dressed up in a false one. How strong is their case? She asked. Weak, Carol said, without an instant's hesitation. They have no medical evidence whatsoever. Their witnesses have either no meaningful recent contact with you, or an obvious personal grievance against you, or both. And framing your decision to hire an attorney and an accountant as undue influence is going to work against them, not for them. Because the logical conclusion of that argument is that any older adult who consults a lawyer is thereby proving their own incompetence. And no serious judges is going to sign on to that. It is not zero, Dorothy. No case is ever zero, but we are going to walk in there with something solid. She laid out the plan once more calmly, point by point. Dr. Park's evaluation first. She would push to get it scheduled within the week, given the timeline. Then sworn statements from Phil, from Dorothy's longtime physician, from Patricia, and from anyone else with regular, recent, meaningful contact who could speak to her clarity and her competence. And Angela's account of that dinner party, of the comment about Dorothy being a part-time job, went directly to the question of motive. And motive was the whole rotten heart of the thing. I want to prepare you for something, Carol added. This is going to be hard, and I don't want it to take you by surprise. You are going to have to sit in a courtroom and listen to people, including your own son, testify under oath that you are mentally incompetent. You're going to hear things that are distorted, and you're going to hear things that are simply false. And you are going to have to sit still through all of it and let me handle the response, rather than responding yourself. I've been doing exactly that for 34 years, Dorothy said, sitting still while someone says something incorrect and waiting for the right moment to address it. That's most of what teaching is. There was a small pause on Carol's end of the line. Right, she said, yes. That's actually a very good way to think about it. The hearing was set for a Tuesday in late August, about 6 weeks out, and those 6 weeks had a strange quality that Dorothy would later describe to Patricia as living inside a fishbowl. She was aware constantly that her every move could be observed and documented by Ryan and Brittany in exactly the same way she was observing and documenting theirs. But the awareness did not make her paranoid, it made her precise. She kept her routines deliberately and visibly. She went to her physician for her regular checkup. She went to the dentist. She kept up the monthly lunch with the retired teachers group she'd rejoined after years of letting it slide. She kept her house spotless and her finances current and her correspondence prompt and professional. She answered every one of Carol's emails within hours. And she documented every contact. 2 more calls from Ryan in the first stretch, and then silence. A single text from Brittany. I hope you know we're only doing this because we love you, which Dorothy screenshotted and added to the file without writing a single word back. And in those same 6 weeks, almost without noticing she was doing it, Dorothy began to rebuild the parts of her own life she had let quietly wither away during the long years of paying. She walked with Patricia every Thursday morning, 3 miles through the Millbrook Park system, at a pace that was easy on her knee, the two of them talking the way old friends talk once they've finally stopped pretending they don't need each other. Patricia had known Dorothy for 22 years. She had known Gerald, She had watched from the outside as Dorothy gave and slowly disappeared into the role of the provider. She never once said, "I told you so," because the truth was she had never quite said anything at all. But she also did not pretend, even for a second, to be surprised. "You want to know what I noticed?" Patricia said one Thursday as they came around the bend by the duck pond. "About 4 years ago. Ryan used to call the school sometimes, and if you weren't in your room, he'd say to whoever answered, 'Is she okay?' Just like that. 'Is she okay?' And then somewhere along the way it changed. And it became, 'Can you have her call me?' That's all. 'Can you have her call me?' I noticed it at the time. I just never knew what on earth to do with it." Dorothy walked beside her in the cool morning light and turned that over for a long while and did not try to soften it. She also, in those weeks, began seeing a therapist of her own, not as some gesture toward Ryan's version of events, but because Carol had quietly pointed out that a documented voluntary therapeutic relationship, one that clearly predated the hearing and was undertaken on Dorothy's own initiative, was a genuinely useful thing to have on the record. Dorothy agreed to it for that reason, and then, to her surprise, she found the sessions useful for reasons that had nothing at all to do with the case. Her therapist, Dr. Vera Osi, was warm and precise and entirely free of the gentle, evasive misdirection that Dorothy had always found so patronizing in people. She asked direct questions and she gave direct answers. And in their third session, she said something that Dorothy wrote down in her notebook, not for Carol, not for the case, but for herself. "The guilt you keep describing, the feeling that you should have done more, given more, been more. I want you to consider that this guilt was installed in you, carefully and over a long time, by people who needed it to be there, because that guilt is what kept you giving. It was functional for them, it served them, and it has never once told you anything true about what you actually owe anyone or about what you're actually worth." Dorothy sat with that one for a very long time. The evaluation with Dr. Susan Park took place 4 weeks before the hearing in a quiet assessment room at the Ohio State Medical Center, and it ran for 2.5 hours. Cognitive screening, memory testing, executive function, emotional regulation, a long, structured clinical interview covering Dorothy's whole history, her current circumstances, and her reasoning in detail behind the decision to stop the support. And at the very end, Dr. Park set down her materials and gave Dorothy her preliminary impressions plainly. "Your cognitive scores are in the high normal range for a woman your age, which is to say, they're excellent. Your memory, your executive function, your reasoning, your emotional regulation, all of it fully intact. There is no evidence of any cognitive impairment whatsoever. And from a clinical standpoint, I want you to hear this clearly. The decision you made to stop financially supporting your son and his wife is precisely the kind of healthy, self-protective response we would expect to see from a person who has correctly recognized a harmful situation and acted to protect herself from it. It is the opposite of decline, Mrs. Callahan. It is the single clearest sign of health in this entire file." Dorothy thanked her, and she drove home through the flat gold summer afternoon, windows rolled all the way down, the radio tuned to a station playing the old country music Gerald had loved, and that she hadn't been able to bear listening to in years. The warm air rushing through the car smelled of cut fields and of distant coming rain. She had decided something, somewhere in those 6 weeks, without ever quite putting it into words. She was not going to wait for a verdict to start living again. She was going to start living again right now and let that living, that walking, and that painting, and that laughter with Patricia stand as the evidence. The hearing was held on a Tuesday in late August, on the 4th floor of the Franklin County Courthouse, before a probate judge named Eleanor Brandt, a woman in her 60s who, Carol said, had a well-earned reputation for moving carefully, reading everything, and disliking nothing in this world quite so much as a guardianship petition that smelled of money. Dorothy wore a charcoal gray suit she had bought for the occasion and then had taken in at the waist because she'd lost a little weight over the summer. Not from worry, she'd realized, when the tailor pinned it. From walking 3 miles every Thursday morning and from cooking herself real dinners again At a table she now sometimes set for one without the smallest trace of sadness. She sat beside Carol at the respondents' table. Across the aisle, Ryan sat in a brand new suit and would not turn his head to look at her. Beside him, Brittany was pale and composed and dressed in a dark navy blue that from any distance read very nearly as mourning. Their attorney was an older man named Voss, smooth and silver-haired and radiating the comfortable confidence of a man who had won cases like this one before against frightened, unprepared respondents who'd had no idea what was coming. He did not know what Carol Whitmore had spent 6 weeks quietly building. He was about to find out. His opening statement was almost exactly what Carol had predicted, nearly word for word. Dorothy was painted as a grieving, isolated widow, a woman whose retirement had hollowed out her days and left her dangerously vulnerable, a woman who had fallen under the spell of an attorney and an accountant pursuing their own interests, and who had, in her confusion and her pain, begun to behave erratically, cutting off the devoted family who loved her, installing surveillance equipment around her home, and withdrawing from everyone who had her best interests at heart. He spoke the words cognitive decline slowly and gravely, like a man genuinely sorrowful to have to say them about someone he respected. Then he called the petitioner's witnesses. Brittany testified first, and the performance was, Dorothy had to admit, skilled. She wept at exactly the right moments. She described a Dorothy who had changed, once so warm, now so cold and suspicious, once so close to the family, now walled off and unreachable. She has always been like a second mother to me, Brittany said, her voice breaking beautifully on the word mother. And watching her just slip away like this, it has been the most devastating thing. We only want her to get the care she so clearly needs. On cross-examination, Carol was quiet and slow and methodical, the way a person is when they are very carefully taking apart something fragile. Mrs. Callahan, when is the last time you telephoned your mother-in-law without asking her for money? We talked about all kinds of things. A date. Any date at all will do. I don't remember a specific date. This past May, you and your husband held a graduation celebration. My client contributed $6,000 toward the degree being celebrated that day. Was she invited to the celebration? Brittany's beautiful composure flickered. It was a small event. Was she invited? There was an oversight. And when my client telephoned to mention gently that she hadn't even been told it was happening, did your husband apologize? And then, in the very same conversation, ask her for more money? Voss objected. Judge Brandt, watching everything over her glasses, allowed the question, and Brittany did not answer it well. Ryan was next. And watching her son rise and walk to the stand and raise his right hand and swear, before God and the court, to tell the truth and then sit down and prepare to testify that his mother had lost her mind, was, without any question, the single hardest moment of the entire ordeal for Dorothy. She kept her face perfectly still through all of it. She had 34 years of practice keeping her face perfectly still. He testified that his mother had always been so generous, but that lately she'd grown erratic and irrational, and that he had come to believe, with a heavy heart, that she was being manipulated by outside parties. On cross-examination, Carol let him talk himself well out onto the thin ice, and then gently she closed in. Mr. Callahan, how much money did you receive from your mother over the past 2.5 years? I don't know the exact amount. Does $38,200 sound approximately correct? She's always been generous. How many times in the past year alone did you visit your mother without asking her for money? The silence in the courtroom was total. Is it true, Mr. Callahan, that after your mother informed you she had consulted an attorney, you and your wife arrived at her home and you suggested that she submit to a psychiatric evaluation? We were worried about her. You are 39 years old, sir. Did you require your 68-year-old mother's money in order to pay your own rent? Ryan looked at Voss. Voss looked down at his legal pad. There was no good answer to the question, and Ryan, to his credit or his shame, did not manage to find one. Dennis Farrell testified about Dorothy's personality changes, and then admitted under Carol's quiet cross-examination that he had not actually spoken to Dorothy in 4 years. and that his entire expert assessment rested on a single chance sighting of her across a grocery store parking lot. Carl Hutchins testified about the cameras and the visitors, and then admitted that he had never once in all this time actually spoken to Dorothy about a single one of his concerns. That the steady stream of unfamiliar visitors was, on reflection, 2 or maybe 3 people, and that the loud argument he had heard from across the fence had been, now that he really thought about it, mostly a man's voice, not hers. And then it was Carol's turn to put on Dorothy's case. Dr. Susan Park testified to her evaluation. High normal cognition, 0 evidence of impairment, a decision that was adaptive and healthy rather than symptomatic of anything at all. Phil testified that Dorothy's financial decisions had been rational, deliberate, and correctly executed, and that her spending trajectory before the cutoff had her savings exhausted within 4 years. Dorothy's physician submitted a sworn statement attesting to her excellent physical and mental health. Patricia spoke, simply and warmly, to her friend's clarity and her new vitality. And Angela, quietly, without a trace of drama, looking down at her own hands, recounted the dinner party and the comment about Dorothy being a part-time job and how no one had laughed except everyone and how she'd never been able to forget it. And you could feel the whole room shift on its axis. Finally, Dorothy herself took the stand. Carol asked her one simple question. Why had she stopped the support? And Dorothy folded her hands in her lap, and she turned slightly toward Judge Brandt, and she answered in the clear, carrying, unhurried voice she had used at the front of a classroom for 34 years. The voice that could quiet 26 13-year-olds without ever once being raised. Because I finally understood, she said, that what I had been receiving from them all this time was not love. It was a transaction, wearing the costume of a family. My money was always welcome. I was not. I was asked to pay for a graduation that I was never even invited to attend. She paused, and the courtroom was utterly silent. I am not confused, Your Honor. For the first time in a great many years, I am perfectly, completely clear. That clarity is the only thing about me that has actually changed. And I have come to believe that it is precisely that clarity which frightened them. Voss, on his cross, tried to make her new friendship sound like a different kind of manipulation. Dorothy answered evenly that for the first time in years, she had relationships in her life that were built on something other than the size of her bank account, and that she had learned recently to tell the difference in a way she simply had not been able to before. He tried to make the cameras sound like paranoia. Dorothy answered that she had installed them on the explicit advice of her attorney after her son and daughter-in-law had arrived at her home uninvited, and an attorney they had brought along had attempted to get her to sign a power of attorney without any counsel of her own present in the room. The courtroom was very, very quiet after that. Judge Brandt recessed for 90 minutes, and when she came back and took her seat and put on her glasses, her ruling was unhurried and exact and left no daylight anywhere. The professional neuropsychological evaluation, she said, had established Mrs. Callahan's full cognitive competence beyond any reasonable question. Her financial decisions, however painful they might be for her family, were entirely rational and entirely within her rights as a competent adult. And the evidence presented to the court strongly suggested that this petition had been motivated by financial interest rather than by any genuine concern for the respondent's welfare. The petition for guardianship was therefore denied in full. And then she added one more thing. She set down her papers and she looked over the top of her glasses directly at Ryan and at Brittany for a long moment before she spoke. This court, she said, takes very seriously the misuse of guardianship proceedings as an instrument of financial pressure against vulnerable elders. The two of you should consider yourselves fortunate that I am not on this occasion choosing to refer the matter any further than this room. In the marble hallway outside afterward, Brittany walked straight past Dorothy without a single word, her heels sharp on the stone. Ryan stopped a few feet away from his mother, and for a moment he just stood there. And something moved across his face, something that might have been shame or might have been grief, or might have simply been the dawning recognition of a man who has just lost something he was certain he was going to win. Moms, "Mom, not today, Ryan," Dorothy said. And she said it gently, with no cruelty in it at all. Maybe not for a long time, but not today. And she turned and she walked out of the courthouse and into the bright, heavy, late August afternoon, with Carol on one side of her and Patricia on the other, and her sister Margaret, who had flown in from Phoenix the night before just to be there in that room, coming along right behind. The heat shimmered up off the pavement. Margaret reached over and took her sister's arm and held it, and neither of them said anything, because nothing needed to be said. What happened after was quieter than a story usually wants its ending to be. Dorothy did not sell the house and move to a glittering city and reinvent herself overnight. She was 68 years old and she loved her house, and Gerald's wild roses were still climbing the back fence, and she had no intention of leaving any of it behind. What she did instead was smaller and slower and far more durable. She kept walking with Patricia every Thursday. She kept seeing Dr. Osei for a while until the day came when she realized she didn't need to anymore, and then she stopped. She signed up for a watercolor class at the community center, and she was genuinely, almost impressively bad at it. And she kept going anyway, every week, because she had discovered, to her own surprise, that being cheerfully bad at something brand new was one of the great unexpected pleasures of having her own life back in her own two hands. And she took the money that would once have gone, automatically every month, to Ryan and Brittany, and she did two things with it. The first was that she set up a small, steady, automatic monthly donation to a statewide organization that helps older adults recognize the signs of financial exploitation and find their way out of it. Not a fortune, just steady. The way she herself had once been steady, month after month, for people who never thought to thank her, except that now the steadiness flowed towards strangers who genuinely needed it. And the second was that she booked a trip. 10 days that coming October up the coast of Maine, a thing she and Gerald had always talked at doing and somehow in 31 years had never quite gotten around to. She went by herself, and it was not lonely, not even for an afternoon, because there is a difference between being alone and being lonely. And Dorothy had finally, at 68 years old, standing on a cold and beautiful rocky shore with the gray Atlantic breaking in front of her, learned exactly which was which. She did not hear from Ryan for almost a year, and then, the following summer, a letter came, a real one, handwritten, several pages, with no request of any kind folded up anywhere inside it. She read it through twice, slowly, standing at her kitchen counter, and then she put it in a drawer, and she did not answer it right away. She told me, still deciding. Some doors, she said, you do not slam shut and you do not fling wide open. You simply leave them where they are, and you let time do the patient work that only time can do. The last thing Dorothy wrote to me, I'm going to read to you exactly as she wrote it. I spent 3 years believing that if I just gave enough, I would finally be loved. And I had it backwards the entire time. You cannot buy the thing. If you have to pay for it, then it was never the thing to begin with. I am 72 years old now. I wish with all my heart that I had learned it sooner. But I would so much rather have learned it late than die having never learned it at all. I don't have much to add to that. Dorothy said it far better than I ever could. I'll only say this. If something in her story made your chest go tight just now, if you recognized a pattern, or a feeling, or a telephone that only ever seems to ring when somebody needs something, then I want you to hear me. Take good care of yourselves. And please remember, being needed and being loved have never once been the same thing. I'll see you next time.